let me introduce my friend and colleague. This is Dr. Kyle Reyes. He currently serves as the Vice President of Student Affairs at Utah Valley University. In his previous position as Senior Diversity Officer, he led the development and implementation of UVU's nationally recognized Strategic Inclusion and Diversity Plan, consisting of nearly 40 initiatives that focused on making UVU a more inclusive campus. Kyle's consulted with and presented to organizations in 27 states and Canada, giving more than 500 presentations over the past 16 years on issues of diversity, inclusion, art, cultural competence, voice, identity, multiculturalism, and leadership. If I were to spend time telling you about all the awards and recognition he's received for his work, we'd be here way too long. Just a few of the, well, there's a bunch of...
Don't, just stop there, Jay.
All right. One last thing I do want to say before I go on is I've been able to witness him as an educator, administrator, artist, mentor. I've watched him work with student teachers on the Navajo reservation, Navajo Nation. I've watched him work with as an administrator to get faculty and staff to come together on a common goal. He's done some large-scale urban art, as well as you should really see what he does with a sneaker and some markers. He does some really cool stuff. I've watched him mentor an urban artist, a young student he went from being a tagger to being a potential community leader under Kyle's mentorship. And probably Kyle's most, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but the title that I think he's most proud of is husband and father. I know he would take heroes or take the Polynesian culture and create comic book heroes and tell stories to his children. And I think he's still currently working on a series of comic books that eventually I hope to see published. Some of those stories that he told his children. So with that, I'll turn the time over to Kyle.
Thanks, Jay. That was actually probably one of the cooler introductions ever. Usually they get pretty laborious in their professional stuff. I will say that I'm just so excited to be with you all today. And let me also just acknowledge how much I admire the work that each of you do in terms of really capturing the stories that are on our campuses, the stories of our students. I'm assuming there's folks here from around the nation and perhaps out of the country as well. I know what a transformative presence Jay is on our campus in terms of telling and communicating our stories. What you're going to see here, and I'm going to share my screen if I have permission to do so. Let me share, and hopefully you can see that. And then let me see if it actually works. Can I just get a couple verbal confirmations? Can you see that?
You're good.
All right. And let me just click. So did that transition okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So lenses of humanity. I promise I didn't choose lenses of humanity just to suck up to a number of photographers and professionals of your industry. This is something I've been working on for a number of years. A quick addition to the bio here. I grew up in Los Angeles. If anybody is from the Southern California area, I grew up in San Fernando, right off the 101 freeway and Canoga Park. I started my educational journey of higher education, failing out of 3 colleges in in California: Pierce College, Cal State Northridge, and then UCLA had a summer graffiti art program, a reform program that I failed out of. And so I didn't have the greatest start to my higher education career. Later on, was able to get connected to some graphic design programs, and actually came out to Utah with the graphic design program. At the time, wanted to be sort of connected to urban art, but also had this fascination with animation, and was able to get a degree in graphic design. Started out as a designer for a year for a company here in Utah, and then just said, you know what, I kind of want to go and help more kids that were like me, who felt like they weren't college material, see if we can get to college. And that started my 17-year career now at Utah Valley University. I share all that to say, for the past 12 of the past 17 years has been dedicated to researching and studying a certain aspect of diversity and inclusion, and that is human connection. You know, I'm assuming that many of you on this call have had your fair share of diversity trainings and might even be tired of them, or might have not had the greatest experience, or maybe you'll take all you can get because that's your wheelhouse. I'll say that some of my introductions to diversity trainings and diversity engagements were somewhat sort of full of tension and incendiary. And I noticed that people, more often than not at the time, people would retreat from the conversation because of the way it was presented, rather than you know, actually considering that, you know, a presenter or somebody or a text might actually have a point, because somehow we easily lump diversity issues into these very political terms. And so I'd love to just, if I can, just invite this whole group today to just not think of this necessarily as a diversity conversation, as you might have constructed in the past or attended in the past, but more of a just returning to humanity conversation. I do think COVID-19 has caused us to ask many questions about human connection and those things. And so this is stuff that I've been working on, in addition to the comic books that I'm working on for my kids and others who would dare read my Polynesian superhero comic books. I'm also working on a book called Lenses of Humanity. And so this is some of that work, cultivating purpose and connection. And Nate, I will let you know, because I'm in presentation mode, I actually can no longer see the chat. Let me see, hold on. Let me see if I just click on something. So I might need your help more than I even know. Okay. I'll pause here and there if that's okay for some questions.
Yep, not a problem.
So thank you. So really, I start with this premise that we humans long for connection, purpose and connection. Again, we can have a great debate about what the literature says about humanity and different interpretations, religious perspectives and whatnot. But in all of what I've done in my research, I've really culled it together in terms of these two basic things. If you were to put them in big buckets, humanity really, as I see it, is a lot all about the ability to really find my human sort of potential here, my purpose, what I'm going to do and contribute as a human, and then connecting with other humans. And so that's where I start. And I really, by the way, this is some of the more wordy slides that I have. I do think that we do limit our ability to have those connections when we don't recognize the value of the diversity of the human experience. So again, diversity here is not necessarily advocating today necessarily for any particular identity group and some sort of crusade. Today is more about the recognition that I think we're better humans. I think we're better contributors to our communities and our organizations when we can just inherently and really deliberately value the diverse human experience that comes our way. And then if we're committed to humanity, just being more intentional about that and developing diverse lenses. So a lot of this is grounded in cultural competence work and literature. And so this is around the idea of, first, before we can develop the skills around cultural competence or sort of humanity-driven life, it's an awareness of self and others, an understanding of diversity of worldview and lenses, and then the skills that we need. And I was a professor for 7 years in our School of Education. And so I had the honor and privilege, and I guess I still am, I teach one class now in the summer, even though I'm full-time administrator. And that is, I teach in the School of Education those that are going on to become K-12 teachers. So I spent some time in K-12, those that are going to go on to become kindergarten through 12th grade teachers. And I've taught 4 courses. One of those courses is called Multicultural Understanding. And the course was added to our curriculum because we wanted to make sure that the teachers that we're preparing for the classroom, no matter where they're going to go teach, really understand the nuance and value the nuance of the students that are now entering their classrooms and the full range of diversity that is being brought to that classroom, not just racial and gender diversity, but a whole host of other forms of diversity. When I teach that class, I often talk about this, the awareness, understanding, and skills, and my students will say something like, hey, in my classroom management class, we learned this skill and we just learned, what to do in this situation. Can you tell me, I get it. I get diversity. Just tell me what I need to do. And one of the things that we talk about is it's really hard to just have a rubric or a metric to say to somebody, in this scenario, when somebody says this racist thing, this is exactly what you do. So much of it starts with our awareness of what lenses we bring to that interaction, that observation, that interpretation. And so even in today's presentation, the bulk of the time is spent on what we can do as community citizens to just be more aware, right, of how we approach our work. And then a little bit on understanding. And then finally, I'll have like a slide on skills, but really the bulk of the time spent on awareness. A little bit more about this. I don't know if it cuts off the picture there, but in my screen, my mom's face is actually cut off a little bit. She's on the right. She grew up on the big island of Hawaii. She's Hawaiian Japanese. There's my grandparents, my uncles. That's part of my narrative. I cannot deny that I have certain lenses that I look at this world. I can't deny that the Pacific Islander, the Asian Pacific Islander identity, interpreted through my mom and the experiences then she passed to me, have influenced how I view the world and why I hold some of the values I do. My father's from the Philippines. I share this piece of information not for any sort of sympathy or anything, but just as my context right now as I talk about my father. This is the first presentation I'm actually giving since my father passed away 3 weeks ago. My dad passed away from a 2-year battle of cancer and in Los Angeles, and we have not been able to take care of him in the proper way because of COVID. My sister's in Valencia, California. My brother and I are here in Utah. Why do I share that? Well, our lenses shift without us even realizing it, because I have a whole host of experiences from my childhood in Los Angeles or San Fernando. And based on my father's influences and based on his experiences in the Philippines that he then brought to me as an artist, as a musician, and all that stuff. And I look at the world through artistic lenses, I think. I look at the world through creative lenses, through very colorful lenses. And that's because of my father. And I'm starting to realize that more and more since my father passed 3 weeks ago, where my brother, my sister, and I are unpacking all of the ways that our dad influenced how and why we are at the place that we're at right now, and in a very touching and very real way. As was mentioned by Jay, urban art. I'm into street art. Some might call it graffiti art. I have helped UVU students produce murals on our campus. And I continue to do it to this day, not illegally, but I continue to engage in promoting urban art as a form of actually a community aesthetic to say, let's appreciate these artists and let's not demonize them. Let's see if we can get them to college and refine some of their artistic skills so that they can actually be paid for this skill. But this is part of my upbringing. And then I want to jump now to the actual development of our lenses. Before I do, however, and before I jump into the meat, the next 10 slides is really the meat of the presentation. I just want to pause. Can I just ask is there anybody, or Nate, are you seeing in the chat there, any questions, or are there any connections that people are making, even with my experience, that you're willing to just offer up really quickly?
Yeah, there is one question from Glenn. He asked earlier, how does empathy figure into diversity?
Oh my goodness. It's almost like you've seen slide number 27 or something already. I'm definitely going to get there, because to me, empathy development is all around humanity-driven life development. I mean, it is right there. Our ability to empathize with another's experience, and again, we'll get into this more later, but is directly linked to our disposition, even the desire for us to that we can actually learn from another person and not think that our view is the right way, or our version of normal is what everybody else considers to be good and normal, right? That it's really hard to empathize when we haven't had exposure to that diversity, and more to come on that, but excellent question. Any other connections with anything I've shared so far?
I think we're good.
So no one else is Filipino, Hawaiian, Japanese, huh? Not one other person on this call. I'm just kidding. All right. And Nate, again,
Eric is half Japanese and born in Hawaii. So there you go.
Oh, there we go. Eric, at some point, let's connect further on this. And by the way, just as a teaser, Jay told you that I do art on shoes. I'll actually show you some of my shoe art at the very end. So if you're tempted to log off, just know that the shoe art is coming. Lens development. Okay. So those that studied psychology or even read a book on the brain or mindsets or anything around the brain, you'll recognize, or even took one class on psychology or neurology. Trust me, when I was in high school, I didn't study any of this stuff, even in college. It wasn't until my grad programs that I really started to get into understanding how and why we think the way we do. We're born with billions of neurons. When we're born with these neurons, there's the synaptic connections that occur is where we code information. So again, some of you might be nodding your heads. I can't see if you are, but if this resonates with you or if you've heard this before, you'll recognize that we code information at a very early age. We start to process and code information. And usually it's not by formal education. It's by experience, right? It's by touching something that's hot, or it's by somebody laughing at something, that making fun of us, and we have a bad feeling, and all of a sudden it gets coded in our brain. I didn't like that feeling. Well, let me take you to a hospital delivery room for just a second. And it's my youngest, who was delivered January 4th, 2017. Her name, I'll give you her full name, just so you can appreciate the Hawaiian trouble that we just put her in. And then I'll give you the name that we call her. So her full name is Kehau Anuhea no Kealohalani. That's her first name. And it's in honor of my mother, who passed away as well 5 years ago, but it was part of her name. We call her Anu, so baby Anuhea, or Anu. Anuhea was born at Utah Valley Regional Medical Center, January 4th, 2017. Now my wife, my partner, her name is Michelle. She's from the Navajo Nation. So yes, I just added one more culture to that mix, if you will, for my kids. You'll see one photo of them later. She was about to deliver Anuhea, and the nurses came in at Utah Valley Regional Medical and gave us a little pamphlet that said, we want you to be aware of the skin-to-skin program that we have here that we do with Intermountain Healthcare at IHC. And we said, great, we're familiar with this. We had children here before. And they said, okay, will you sign this document that said we've given you all this information about nursing and this and that? Great. Well, it's a reminder to me that the skin-to-skin program, basically what they do is they say, okay, the research of this one pamphlet says that the connection between mother and child is so powerful that instead of taking the newborn infant child after the umbilical cord is cut, and the nurses with their rubber gloves takes the child over to the little incubating station and warms them up and cleans them off and then swaddles them and brings them back to the exhausted mother, they are going to take the naked infant child, and after the umbilical cord is cut, place the child on the upper chest of the mother to make a skin-to-skin connection, because of what research says is such a powerful connection for that first imprinting, if you will. So what happened on January 4th is I cut the umbilical cord, and the nurses took Anuhea and placed her, she was crying, they placed her on Michelle's upper chest here. And as soon as she touched down, Michelle started caressing her cheek and singing to her a song in Navajo, which is essentially a 1-2 buckle my shoe. It's a counting song. Every culture has a counting song. But she's singing this song, and that's a song that she had actually sung to Anuhea while Anuhea was in the womb. Well, Anuhea quiets down, and then shortly after latches on for nursing with Michelle. At a very early age, from the time we are born, or even, again, different scientists argue different things, but we are coding things like belonging and safety and love and intellect and talents at a very, very early age. Maybe not hypercognitively, like we're not aware that we're developing those codes, but we are. This is a picture of Michelle and Anuhea at the day of the delivery. And this is Anuhea now. That's my little baby girl. I think not too long ago, she was downstairs screaming with one of her brothers picking on her or something, but that's her now. So this drawing here, or this thing, is the neurons, and every interaction we have, it sends us a signal in our brain of a certain connection or a certain code that really is very powerful in our brains. So depending on your upbringing, depending on the religious affiliation of your parents and raising, depending on the structure of the home, did you live with a single parent, the first language you learned, all that stuff, it all adds to the coding of how and why you view the world the way you do. And every interaction we have and experience we have after that continues to code. Obviously, if we hear something repeated over and over again without even maybe believing it the first time, over and over again, that repetition is part of the imprinting of the code in our minds. And because I usually in the educational field and talking to folks like you and other fellow educators who are part of the educational enterprise, you know, this matters to us because of the students that we serve and the very people that whose stories we're trying to tell, and or to at least acknowledge as a university. So they form the schema, the scripts, the lenses that we have, how we view the world. And the schema are basically the categories or the big boxes where we categorize all this information that we're gathering over time, right? The scripts are the things that we follow because that's all we see. So if my father worked in this industry, again, this was perhaps a generation or two ago, we might have said, because of a lack of internet and exposure to diversity of careers, at the time, we might say, well, I'm just going to follow what I see happening with my dad or my uncle, or I might see what's happening with my mother or my aunts or whatever in terms of careers. Now, because of exposure, sheer exposure, there is something else that's creeping in of, oh, I could actually consider that. That might be something that I could do. Before we continue, Nate, can I just check in? Are any questions coming in on anything so far?
No questions. One comment that was good, that was saying that they can relate to that last slide, being autistic. They always struggle with belonging and perceptions of smart, stupid. So
yeah. And what's really interesting, thank you for whoever shared that. What's really interesting about the stories we tell ourselves about, you know, from a very young age. I mean, I remember, no joke, I went to Hamlin Street Elementary in Canoga Park in Woodland Hills, technically. And I wore a Michael Jackson jacket with, you know, black leather jacket with zippers and matching Michael Jackson black leather pants with zippers. And I was like, man, I am the coolest looking kid here at Hamlin Elementary. And I went to school and it was like just a roast. I mean, it was Comedy City there, it's Comedy Central. I mean, people just teased me to no end. And I asked folks, right? And I asked my students, do you think I wore that again, that outfit again? And some were like, well, depending on your personality, you're like, well, screw them, I'm just going to wear it again. And I said, well, yeah, I would like to have thought that I would have had that thick skin, but at the time that affected me greatly. I didn't want to wear that thing at all. And so we're gatherers of where, you know, if we make a comment in class or even in a staff meeting and our boss shoots us down, or the teacher kind of teases us for even asking that question, we gather that, we code that, and then we say, oh, I don't want to have that feeling again. Why would I make a comment again with this boss or this teacher in the room? If you have an accent, right? If you're somebody who English wasn't your first language and you're trying to express yourself, and then you make a comment and somebody's like, speak English, idiot, or whatever, that stays with you for a long time, folks, into adulthood. And that could have happened when you were in third grade. And so you're always hesitant to engage because of that code that's been in your mind about that really negative feeling. And I will say that negative codes, coming back to this, negative coding is much more powerful than positive coding. And so a really bad negative experience, a traumatic experience, will code in our brains as a reality or the story we tell ourselves way more than a bunch of positive codes. And I think you all get that, right, at some level. You have a performance evaluation or something and somebody gives you 20 compliments and they give you one thing that you need to work on. What are you going to dwell on for the next 24 hours? It's the one thing it's the negative that they told you, right? Same with children and kids. You can tell them, oh, you're so smart, you're doing great, but they get one failing grade or they get one thing, and all of a sudden their story and the codes that are in their mind start to have a disconnect. One thing about this particular TED Talk, and I absolutely love this, I would invite, if you're a fan of TED Talks, please go watch Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk from about 10 years ago. It's literally called Danger of a Single Story. And without trying to steal her thunder, even though, you know, She now has turned that into a couple of books and other things. One of the most watched TED Talks. She argues that, and she talks in a very personal way about growing up in a village in Africa where her only portal to the outside world were these books from England who painted everybody in the same, with the same brushstroke. And so her belief of the outside world, outside of her village in Africa, was basically, oh, everybody that's not here in my village probably looks like this, has a dog, has a white picket fence, and that's their world, right? And it was a single story about the world outside of her because of a lack of exposure. So she talks about this idea of, when we create a single story, we show people as one thing, as only one thing over and over again, that's what they become. And as it relates to the images that come across our coding, right? The very images that we're putting in people's minds about what we're about, right? So Utah Valley University, and Jay and I sit down and we talk through, hey, what are we trying to communicate with this photograph that you're taking, or this whole coverage? And I like this photograph better than this photograph because it's part of telling our story, and it's part of communicating that we want people to know that no matter what your background, no matter what walk of life, you are welcome at UVU. We want you at UVU. We actually are projecting that we can see you here at UVU, and your identities and backgrounds. And so she talks about this, right? That if people see one thing over and over again, that's what they become. And that it's up to us really to break the single story for other people by and restore their dignity. Part of that is empowering people to become authors of their own stories. Part of that is just flooding the market, so to speak, with the diversity and the range, right? And so I will say, photography and our marketing at UVU has dramatically changed since I joined UVU 17 years ago, in terms of how we represent we just happened to capture what was happening that day. Well, no, are we capturing all the various diverse things that are happening on campus and representing perhaps our values and some of the commitments we have to inclusion and the diversity of our students? And so again, the danger of a single story is there. And what's interesting about this is I share this photo. I think with this group, I'm safe, that probably 99% of this group will know what this is a picture of, but I will promise you that I have students now where every year that goes by, I ask my students, what is this picture of? And every year, less and less actually know what it is. In fact, just 2 years ago, about half of the students raised their hands. Now, if I asked, 3 months from now, I bet you just a quarter of the students might raise their hands. But this one student said to me, I saw that in Harry Potter. And I said, oh, that's good. Along with the abacus and all the other archaic devices for learning. I go, and we get through this, but I said, okay, I tell them a little bit of a history about these used to be in libraries and all that Dewey Decimal and whatnot. But that's not the point of this. I talked to them about how in our brains, we literally have thousands of these card catalog boxes for each category of experience, and what some psychologists would call what's called schema. So you would have in your food boxes, you would have like a particular food that you hate. So in your mind, go ahead and pull out a box of a food that you just hate. So pull out that box and think about all the cards of information that you've gathered about that food over the years, and why you have such negative feelings and reactions towards that food. When did it start? What was the earliest card that was put in there? Was it when you were 2 and you just, I'm just going to say it. I love Brussels sprouts, but somebody might have Brussels sprouts. So they put Brussels sprouts, and then all of a sudden they have a story of, yeah, I hate Brussels sprouts. And so that was in there again. And I tried it again when I was 7 and I hated it. And it's interesting because we collect cards in these boxes, sometimes on purpose, but most of the time, the cards that end up in these boxes are just because we are humans and we're happening to live and we're just gathering data without even realizing it. So one particular study I like to point to is one done by a professor out of Duke University. His name is Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And Dr. Bonilla Silva says, this was in 2003. So again, I give you that date on purpose. Dr. Bonilla Silva traveled to a number of states, and he would ask groups, what's the first image that comes to your mind of the person, the race of the person, and what this person might be wearing? What do they look like? And don't try to overthink it. He just says, what's the first image that comes to your mind when I ask this group, when I say the word doctor, okay? And boom, everybody kind of has a different image. Boom, I said doctor. Is it first, unpack in your mind, what was the first image that came to your mind? Male, female, what race, age, just what would describe that? And so he conducted a whole bunch of these sort of focus groups and experience. And then he said, okay, he went through all these words, and then he landed on this word, and he said, okay, next word is, and again, don't overthink it, the first one that comes to your mind, and he said terrorist. Remember the study, this year-long study done in 2003. Terrorist, he said, go. And what was fascinating for him, with all of these other titles, people had a very diverse range of images that came to their mind because of their lived experiences of a professor, a doctor, a lawyer, somebody that works at the grocery store, a teacher, whatever it might be. When it came to terrorist, he noticed that there was a single story, and he was fascinated by the fact that nobody actually actively put that card in that box, right? And he didn't use the whole card box thing, but he just says, I don't know if anybody intentionally got a whole bunch of identity cards together and said, hey, let's vote on what we should imprint in our brains of what image is tied to the word terrorist. But it was fascinating for him. And you all know, I've obviously, stolen the punchline. In 2003, that question received a specific collective communal response that might have been different if he asked it in 1980, right? If he asked that question, or if he asked that question in 1940. Context is everything related to how we interpret, the exposure to diversity that we're interpreting. And so what's interesting is, let's just take, and by the way, the answer obviously, I think, to everyone would be that the common answer for him, for Dr. Bonilla Silva, was that Middle Eastern male with facial hair and something, a sort of wrap over their head and body, was the most common. I mean, he's talking about, and this is significant, folks, for research like this. I mean, he's talking about over 85% of his respondents were having that same image come to mind. So what I've done then is taken that step further with some of my classes and to say, okay, take out the Middle Eastern male, just that particular identity, whatever is in your mind about what represents a Middle Eastern male. Take that out, that box out in your brain. And how many cards in that box would you consider to be positive associated, and how many would you consider to be negative associated? And what I've asked then is for people to volunteer and offer up and say, why do you think those that have the majority of your cards in the card catalog box positive, why do you think that is? And so let me throw that out to this group right now and see if I can jump into, I'm going to try to do this here because I see some questions coming in. You can still see this slide, right? Okay. And now let me see if I can see the chat. Okay, I can jump on the chat here. And the question I'd like to ask for just a little bit of feedback here is well, I'm looking at my time and I want to get to these questions here. So perhaps let me see if I can do this. The reasons that people gave were of why they had positive associations or positive boxes in their card catalog box was because of exposure, of friendships with meaningful relationships, visitations to countries, and relationships. Those that had the majority of the cards in their card catalog box as negative, they talked about how, yeah, they just didn't have those meaningful engagements and exposure. Before I move on this and really kind of then pivot and transition, because I think, thank you, Glenn. Answer questions, shared experience equals. Okay, let me answer some questions, and I apologize to those who we haven't engaged first. Thank you for the link there to Danger of a Single Story. Okay. So Stephen, how do you balance telling diverse stories, advocating for diverse values, representation, versus feelings of tokenization? And let me just see, I think there is a connection here with other questions. So a big debate on most campuses centered on authenticity versus diversity and inclusion. We want to show and promote diversity, but there's a pushback if we're not reflecting existing demographics. Third, our challenge is that there's very little visible diversity. So while we're expected to depict it, it does become a challenge, okay? And I have this challenge, regional campus in central Indiana, visible diversity is thin. Okay, so let me see if I can address some of these and most of these here with some thoughts. And again, please, by the way, I'd love to hear voices. If after I respond to these questions, if other people want to nuance their question or ask a follow-up question, let's just pause the whole presentation for right now and really get to these questions. So in the diversity literature, the debate about authenticity versus the sort of what you want to promote. It is pretty consistent now. And again, I'm not talking about the diversity in photography literature. I don't know that literature. I'm just talking about strategic diversity planning to move forward and sort of the ethical debates around representation. That's what I'm referring to. Is that in business and in education, most diversity scholars would agree that you want to project what you value and the story that you value. And so if you're talking about erring on the side of, well, we have this percentage, and so I want to make sure that this racial percentage and breakdown is matched in every one of our publications and on our website, that we have exactly 72% of this race and 5% of this race and down the road. That has a certain ethic to it, right? There's a certain accuracy to it. But that the desire is to, again, with the diversity literature, is that we agree that by communicating and showing the value of diversity, that not only has it shown that it will attract more diversity because of all the signals and codes and messages that people receive about seeing themselves there, but it also leads to conversation, these very conversations where I have had as a senior diversity officer. I'll just tell you, I had a student in my office about 3 or 4 years ago, an African-American student who came to UVU and pointed to one particular publication. And the publication had one African-American student on it among four people on the cover of a publication. So I believe there was a Latino young man, there was an African-American man, Asian Pacific Islander woman, and a white woman. This gentleman was in my office and he just said, hey, I saw that. I was really excited because I thought that maybe it would be a lot more diverse like I saw on your publication. And frankly, Dr. Reyes, in my classes, I'm like the only one, and I'm not seeing as many. Now I do see them around campus and I see some diversity, but it was a little different than I expected. And so we had this long conversation, right? Because I think this is cutting to the very questions that some of you are asking. And we had a long conversation, and the conversation led to this idea of, I said, can you tell me about your overall experience here at the university? Oh, I've loved it here. People are so nice. They're great. How's your academic experience been? Oh, it's been really good. The teachers are supportive. Wonderful. I said, let me just level with you. You're right at some level that that particular, if your interpretation of that particular image there caused you to think that we had 25% African-American students, perhaps, I apologize for that. I said, one of the things, and I just leveled with him, I said, one of the things that we want you to communicate with all that we're doing for the 36 diversity initiatives we had at UVU, again, at the time, is that we embrace the change, and you're a part of that change, and we embrace your identity, and we ask for your voice to help us get better. But I said, you know what, I don't feel comfortable having, for the last number of years, we've really shifted, just having the images reflect the direct percentage of what we actually have. I said, because I do think the larger collective experience that we have on campus. Now, if his answer was, yeah, I'm facing hardships on all aspects of this campus. The academic experience sucks. Everybody's mean. Not only do I not see people that are of my racial identity, but all these other negatives, then I would ask the question of our whole university. We really in addition to compositional diversity, we are really not hitting the mark on this inclusive culture and climate and feeling when students are on our campus, whatever their race might be. And so we talked about it, and he actually, by the time we were done, he said, you know what, I agree. He goes, look, I've had a good experience here. I've told my other friends to come here. And he goes, and now that you've talked about it that way, I would love to be on a cover. I would love to be a part of promoting the commitment that UVU has to diversity instead of the exact percentages or numbers. And so that's not a clean answer. I would just say that from most diversity experts, we are leaning on the side of and erring on the side of encouraging more visible representation of diversity where possible. Let me get to then the other nuanced part of some of these questions, and that is, what if there's just no diversity in our area, in our region, in our demographic and whatnot? And look, I'm not telling you to go to some other university or get stock photos or whatnot. I mean, again, I do think you've got to, students can look up data online now. And what I've noticed is students are becoming much more savvy at looking at other markers than just the images that they're looking at. If somebody feels like, I wonder if this campus is LGBTQ plus friendly. I've heard things about Utah. I've heard things about Utah Valley University. I have some real doubts about the state of Utah or whatever it might be around sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. I'm going to do my own research. And I had a number of phone calls, whether it's employees coming to work at the university or students, to just say, hey, I'm curious what is in place in terms of supports. I don't necessarily, I don't know what image, we would talk with focus groups. I don't know what image would be the ultimate representation to signal a commitment to sexual orientation, gender identity. But it was helpful to see on your website, LGBT Student Services and your Spectrum Club. And it was helpful to see photos from benefit concerts you have done for scholarships for students who self-identify as LGBTQ+, and on and on. And so they said they found it in different markers, not that every publication had to have perhaps what some might consider a stereotyped visual of somebody who would self-identify as LGBTQ+. We've talked about diversity in terms of ability and disability. And again, not that there has to be some formula where in every publication we feel like we have to have somebody in a wheelchair, but in the aggregate, in all of the complement of things that UVU is putting out on social media. And by the way, social media has become one of these things where because of all the accounts UVU has now on Instagram, we've got Instagram going out from LGBT Student Services, from our Latino Initiative, from our Veteran Success Center, from our First Generation Initiative, all these various, and they're targeting the affinity groups that have opted into following that social media. Well, where are they pulling some of that photography? They're pulling some of that photography from some things that they do as a department, but some things from our central photography bank, and talking with Jay and saying, hey, you covered this event for me. Can I get access to that photo of our big Latino celebration? And then, because I want to push that out on social media. So in the aggregate, is the university, is the college showing the range of diversity? And again, not that every publication has to have the so-called checkbox area here. Again, there's more questions here, but I just want to pause because I feel like, does anybody want to respond to any of that or have further questions related to anything I just said on that?
Okay, I think one of the things that we run into is just making that argument with the people who are saying, hey, this isn't authentic, and we need to be authentic without, pushing an agenda.
Gotcha.
So anyway, some of the things you said will help in making the argument back.
Okay.
Well, I think so we're a small school, and we've kind of been on the side where our students of color, because we're small, feel in some ways overrepresented. Not that and we've been trying to do a bit of both and kind of balance that line of authenticity and trying to err on the side of telling a diverse story, but also trying to show, stories of LGBTQ+, and, all of that and they have this feeling of tokenization a little bit, and we're trying not to. We're really trying to go out of our way to say, we really want to include you in this process. We want to include you on all facets of how we market the university, not just in using your image, but really in hearing your story and telling your story. And it's been a rough balance.
And when you say, and by the way, who's speaking? Is that
Stephen?
Stephen. So Stephen, when you say small college or small university, can you just give me because
we're 1,000 students.
1,000?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I consulted with a group out in Kentucky who faced similar things. And now you might have just said this and maybe I glossed over it anticipating one thing, but did you say, have you had focus groups with the students to talk through these very issues? The students who might feel tokenized, or even employees or others who have you had those conversations with the groups themselves?
We have, and we're kind of undergoing a transition right now. We're in the process of hiring a new diversity inclusion officer. Okay. And so we're kind of we've kind of had a year where we've been in that transition process, which I think has made it harder, not having that person involved. But I know some of our students on the retention side have had a harder time because, we've represented diversity, right? And then they get here and there's not diversity, especially for the students of color. And then there's that a little bit of feeling exhausted, not academically. They've had a great academic experience and overall the university is very inclusive, but there's just nobody like them.
Yeah. Some scholars talk about that as racial battle fatigue. It's sort of this death by 1,000 cuts. You don't know why you're exhausted, but you're sort of having to navigate this sense of feeling alone without knowing how to name that experience of feeling alone, because nobody gets you. Nobody gets your identity, perhaps. Stephen, thank you for that. Let me just, again, and I appreciate you adding the piece of the rest of their campus experience has been phenomenal. Because some of the colleges and schools that I've consulted with on diversity, not specifically on images, but on diversity overall, is that what's interesting is if students perceive they have advocates, even if the advocates aren't their same identity, their navigation of that campus experience is much again, it's much better, much easier, much safer. And so there have been cases and there's been situations where, and in the state of Utah is where I'm most familiar because of the 8 public institutions and the 3 private institutions, and really just I've been going between the various institutions. A lot of the things that come up along the lines that you're talking about, it hasn't been the story you just shared. It's been students who have said, I haven't had a great overall experience at some of the institutions. And then on top of that, what exacerbates all that is I just don't feel like anybody knows how to advocate for me or mentor me or gets me enough to fight for me. And so not knowing your institution, not knowing all the various political transitions you might be facing with a new senior diversity officer, that is always an interesting exercise in and of itself. I would say that the more dialogues that we can have with the very populations who are feeling either underrepresented or over tokenized have really informed us in our thinking. So there's been situations I know where Jay and other photographers at UVU, they've presented. So let's just talk about UVU's Native American initiative. And you were to see some of the things that we're doing for our American Indian Native American communities. Well, when they do a photo shoot for our powwow or for some other event or something, or somebody shows up to an inauguration and they've got a headdress on or something, and we're just trying to capture this narrative that we are paying attention to, that we see the Native American identities and narratives. We've actually shown different photos to these groups, and I've said to our Native Wolverine Association, which is our student club, and said, which of these images do you like? Which of these images resonates with you? Which of these images do you feel like strikes that balance between not being stereotypical, like a tribal stereotypical feather and regalia, and which honors still the fact that UVU is supporting your Native American experience here. And they've given opinions, great. And then our team has been able to tell Jay and August and some of these others, yeah, we really prefer this one. And there's a give and take. But again, we have been able to, again, by no means perfect at this, but we've been able to navigate some potentially thorny situations by just having the conversation. And here's the thing, to me, it's not just the marketing and communications team. I mean, this is a conversation that needs to be happening at the leadership levels, right? And I know not everybody on this call can control that, but the commitment to this can't just be in the way that we visually represent. The commitment to this has to be throughout the culture of the university. And so when I've gone to places and consulted, I have talked to some folks who were like, look, I get what you're saying, but under this president, under this administration, with the culture we have here, we're not even close to accomplishing what you think we should accomplish. And I don't feel comfortable marketing to students that we are all welcoming and inclusive of them if I know that internally our structures and our culture isn't ready to receive them in the way and I don't have the answer to that. I am so sorry, because that is a larger systemic structural cultural issue where I could say, well, why don't you go talk to the chief diversity officer, or why don't you go talk to leadership on this? But I know in some communities, this is a very polarizing topic. Now I feel horrible that I spent so much time with the presentation. I'm happy to come back and answer more questions. I apologize. I have a noon call with my boss here at the university. But can I just ask Nate and Jay, as you peruse the questions, are there any other questions that are lingering in the last few minutes here? And again, I'm happy to come back. And next time I come back, I promise I will kick out of presenter mode and get back to your actual questions. So I just want to apologize for that. Any other questions?
Yeah, Kyle, here's one. So I think it's a good question. What do these focus groups look like? They said that they haven't had them there, but they're intrigued by it. It might be a good time to do it.
Yeah, great question. So I would work with student organizations, and I'll just tell you what happens usually in the state of Utah at our various institutions. Most of us have some form of offices directed towards particular populations. So we might have an office for Veterans Affairs, or we might have an office for adult learners, or for LGBTQ, or for multicultural services. But it's in those offices where I just go to the directors and we just say, hey, directors, here's our goal. You have student clubs, you have student organizations. We would really love to make sure we're getting this right. And so there has to be a level of institutional humility first to say, there's something to learn from the very students who are experiencing these things. And so sometimes if it's related to employees, because that's an entirely other conversation, but it's tied to this, and that is employee recruitment, employee projection of what we value on our HR websites. But HR sometimes will do their own focus groups and ask the same things. And we've got a great HR director, and we could connect you with her. She's phenomenal. She would be great to just talk you through how HR gets diverse employees together just to talk about their lived experiences, what they wish they would have known about, like where to live around the university. Like there's different communities and pockets of that value diversity in the community itself. But then back to the students, we have found that if we can just get some of the directors involved and communicate to the students why we're doing this, those students actually are with us because they all of a sudden are like, wow, the university actually cares what we think. And our voice can now influence some of these images that are going out, right? And so Jay and even Nate could tell you, just in the past 5-7 years at UVU, there has been much more representation because the students themselves are like, yeah, I'll show up, I'll be there, I'll add my voice. So that's what it would look like. I would start with the directors of those various centers just to identify a grouping of 8 to 10 students who you feel like, or who they feel like would represent a good cross-section of diverse and underrepresented voices on the campus. I hope that helps, Austin. I think Austin was the one who asked that question.
Yeah, that was. Do we want to go back to the, Fred had a question. Our situation is a bit different. Our challenge, Campus is incredibly diverse with massive international student population. The Asian undergrad community, largest group by far, tends to isolate or sequester among their own peer groups. So it's actually difficult to accurately present them visually on campus because they tend to withdraw from the typical campus population.
Ooh, Fred, thanks for that easy one. I'll say this. I'm just trying to wrap my head around sort of something that would be, I mean, there's definitely some thought here, but let me just see. So it's actually difficult to accurately represent them visually because they tend to withdraw from typical campus population events. Okay, so one of the things that I think every campus marketing division needs to think through or consider is there are a lot more informal events happening than we realize. So I'll just give you an example, and specifically, Fred, to our international student population. We have 30,000 students on campus, 42,000 head count when you count all the high school concurrent enrollment. So, and of that population at UVU, we're at about 800 F1 visa international students. The international students are served primarily, and again, hopefully they're served throughout the whole campus, but in terms of the services that are unique to their F1 visa status and needs, we have an international student services office. It was fascinating for about 4 years ago when I was, over inclusion and diversity, and we were just like, oh, I said, Steve, let me know when the international festival is coming up so we can get a photographer there and we can capture what's going on. And he goes, that's great. He goes, Kyle, do you also want to know the other 20 events we have going on? I said, oh yeah, I actually would. He said, well, every Friday we get together as a potluck and we bring different recipes together over here in the LA building and we just share a meal. And I said, what? And he goes, yeah, it's not, we don't put it on the books. It's not have big fanfare. We just get together and it's authentic. It feels a sense of community. And I'm like, okay, what else? And he goes, well, we have these dedicated nights to share culture. Like we have Japan night, we have Brazil night, and we have all these other things. And I'm like, wait, what? And then he goes, oh, and by the way, we do these tailgates now for some of the athletic events where we serve them dinner and then we all go over together to the soccer game because soccer, right, that international sport. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And so what's interesting is rather than seeing international students and perhaps feeling like you need to get them to the main campus population events, there are these very, whether it's international housing in some campuses and they just share a meal, or sometimes it's just 4 international students just laughing together, playing an instrument or something. There are these very significant moments that are happening that we wouldn't consider major events. And so I would just explore, again, this is probably not the only answer to that, but Fred, I would just explore with the person that has the charge for international student experiences on campus to say, can you give me the full complement of formal and informal activities that are taking place with your international students and see where that goes?
Kyle, it's 12 o'clock now, so I'm not sure if you jump out to talk to President Tumines, but.
I do, and again, folks, just to stay true to my word, I'm gonna skip over all this other stuff and just show you, that's my family, all right? And then these are some of the shoes that I work on, and I designed for my students and for people who have done some things, significant things for me in my life. It's fun. I appreciate anything that has to do with the artistic enterprise and why this all matters to me, of representation and people being able to see themselves in various positions and on college campuses, is because my own children, you can see their diversity. My wife and I are very committed to our cultures of Native American and Polynesian cultures. You can see here, this is one gathering of our Governor's Native American Summit at UVU, where the national anthem sung in Navajo, and 400 people gathering to talk about how we improve Native American student success. And these types of images matter when we are talking to students on the various reservations. Anyway, here's my contact information beyond today. If anybody wants to connect on social media or just email me directly, I'm happy to answer questions beyond this. But August and Jay, if you feel like it's worth your time to bring me back, happy to do so. Thanks, everybody.
You will come back, Kyle.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you.
All right. Well, all right, guys. So let's talk about time. We'll get back to you guys later with the time that we can have Kyle visit with us again. Glenn, is there anything else we need to go over? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. There's so much we probably should go over, but nothing at here. I think the discussion was good. I would say tag us on Facebook or in the group if you're interested in seeing this again, or not this again, but having future conversations. We can definitely try to get that set up.
You know, before we get off, I'm seeing this comment by Ron Kearns, and I'm speed reading it, so I might miss something. But the last part, he says last year, he directly after the conference, he sent an email to his diversity and inclusion officer and a few others in that office and got absolutely no reply. And I get that you would be somewhat reluctant to go back to them, but whether it's been my career on campus or my career working with in sports where I had PR agents who didn't want to talk to me, you have to be persistent. You have to go out back after them. And it doesn't have to be a negative persistence, but I found that sometimes just dropping by somebody's office and start to talk to them on a personal level can open up doors. It might not be that they were avoiding you. It might have been that they were just crazy busy and you got lost in the shovel, but just be persistent on those sort of things. Any other comments? Any other thing we need to talk about right now? All right. Well, I guess we can call it a day, and we'll chat again next week.
Thanks, guys. See you later.